but to not challenge this already challenged environment through the upsetting nature of political negotiations. So we have, in a sense, a very different context for peacemaking today, and it has led people to, or some people, to conclude that this is exactly the wrong time to try to proceed. The argument that some of us make in this volume, I make it in particular in the chapter that I wrote and in the introduction to this volume, is that all of those arguments miss the point. The United States is often called upon to do very hard things, and we often will call upon our military to carry out policies that are very, very hard. We don't back away from doing the hard things because they're hard, and we don't back away from the hard things because there's a prospect of failure. You send troops into battle, you don't know that you're going to succeed. And so the analogy that I tried to draw is, yes, the Middle East peace process is hard. Trying to arrange a settlement between Israelis and Palestinians is not a foregone successful conclusion, but it is something that we can take on, and our diplomats can marshal the diplomatic strength that is parallel to the military strength that our armed forces use to win the battles that they're asked to fight. And in that chapter in which I make this argument, I also push back against the idea of simply trying to return to negotiations. Because after all, if you had willing parties and they were having trouble getting back to the table, we probably wouldn't be here discussing books and articles about the need for a peace process. We would be watching our diplomats trying to come up with acceptable terms of reference, acceptable formulas that bring the parties back to the table, and then, again, we would be shepherding those negotiations. The fact is that Israel, for its internal reasons and its perception of its strategic environment, Palestinians, for their internal reasons, are not at the moment inclined to make the hard choices that are necessary for them to move to negotiations in and of themselves. And that then poses the question for us, is it in the American interest to make them, in a sense, become inclined to return to negotiations? And in making this argument, I also push back against the notion that tactics alone will do the trick. In fact, there are 7 policy elements that I believe are absolutely critical for us to think about if we're going to put together a credible American approach. And when I say policy elements, these would be part of what I hope would be a presidential determination to advance the prospects for peace, and something that our diplomats could then rely upon, knowing what it is that we stand for. And our task, our challenge, would be to try to bring about Palestinian and Israeli agreement on the elements that constitute this approach that would then hopefully impel them back to the negotiating table. Many of these are self-evident, but they're self-evident analytically. They have not been self-evident in terms of our policy process. For example, number 1, here we are in 2013, and we still don't know what the physical template is of a two-state solution. Two-state solution, as you've seen even in recent polls conducted by a variety of very credible polling organizations, indicate substantial support, residual support, in both Palestine and Israel for the idea of a two-state solution. Some of that support is what I would call a result of the impossibility of people understanding that there's an alternative to a two-state solution. Because a lot of people are thinking about alternatives: 1 state, 3 states, 2.5 states, confederation, the Jordan option. You can go down a whole list of potential alternatives. And the populations in both Israel and Palestine are smart enough to know that none of those alternatives works. And so there is this continued support for a two-state solution, but nobody quite knows where it is. what are the borders of the State of Israel? And what are the borders, what will be the borders of the State of Palestine? Now, the Obama administration suggested in 2011, as you recall, that negotiations start on the premise of negotiating borders and security, combining these two critical elements out of an understanding that if you want to achieve a credible outcome, you not only needed to define borders, but those borders had to be defendable, both in terms of security and defendable in terms of the political requirements in both constituencies. It didn't work in 2011, but it doesn't mean that it can't work at moving forward. So the first element of American policy is for us to understand what is the physical template of a two-state solution. And one way to achieve that is to think about a set of parameters that cover borders, that cover security, that cover the issue of refugees, that cover the issue of Jerusalem, that define the American idea, that define American policy with respect to these core issues. Now, let me be clear. I'm not arguing, and I don't argue, that once having defined American views, these become part of an imposed settlement. No. What I am trying to defend is the proposition that until we know what it is that we stand for and what our diplomacy will argue for, we will have a hard time convincing the population of Israel and the population of Palestine to take the very difficult leap into a process of peacemaking with all of the uncertainties that surround it. A third element is to focus in particular, not just in the context of borders, but more largely on the question of security. Security for both Israel and Palestine. As I mentioned, Steve White is here. He and his colleague P.J. Dermer focused a great deal of attention in their chapter in the book on the work that the United States Security Coordinator has been doing over the past few years, not just equipping and training the Palestinian Security Force, but in fact acting as a security liaison, as a security interpreter for both sides, helping the Palestinians understand what it is they need to do for their own purposes, not as a surrogate for Israel, but for their own purposes, to conduct themselves as an independent state, and what Israel needs to do to assure its own security, but to also leave security space for the Palestinians to feel secure in their state. This is an extraordinarily complex issue. It's one that, in fact, the United States, about 4 or 5 years ago, began to look at in a quite determined way. General James Jones, before he became the National Security Advisor, undertook a study for the Bush administration on the elements that would be required in the context of a security agreement between the two sides. That has not yet seen the light of day, but it represents, or should represent, at least the skeleton for us to pursue this approach of trying to help the parties understand that meeting their own security requirements is not mutually exclusive with the other side's meeting its security requirements as well. A fourth or fifth issue, I always lose track when I'm trying to remember what the issues are, is to ensure that the Palestinian state that comes into being is a viable state. Now, the language of viability has now been appropriated by those who want to see an expansive definition of borders. And it's been used in the context of Israeli settlements that if the settlement enterprise, for example, continues in the area of E1 between Jerusalem and Ma'ale Adumim, or if it continues in other areas, it will impair the viability and territorial contiguity of a Palestinian state. But the viability of the Palestinian state is not only a geographic issue. It also has to do with trying to prevent a state from coming into being that ends up being a failed state from day one. Now, 3 years ago, Palestinian Prime Minister Salam Fayyad defined for himself and for his constituency an objective of creating the infrastructure of a state that would withstand the scrutiny of the international community. And he embarked on a 2-year program of state building and economic development that was designed, in a sense, to be put before the quartet, other members of the international community, before world financial institutions, and to hopefully get a passing grade. And in fact, we have seen in the past months, the World Bank and the IMF have given this nascent state of Palestine a passing grade with respect to its institutional and economic viability. It is therefore in the United States' interest to ensure that this exercise in the preparation of Palestinian statehood succeeds. Because if you don't succeed in preparing for the state that you want to come into being, you may end up bringing about a settlement and having a failure of the exercise of state power once that state exists. It means more resources. It means a more significant commitment on the part of the United States and quartet partners. The Europeans very often do a far better job than we in the nitty-gritty work of institution building and economic development. We do good work, but we also can marshal European support and Arab support to make sure that promises of financial and economic assistance to the Palestinians actually are fulfilled and don't leave the Palestinians short when these resources are required in order to build this infrastructure of statehood. A fifth element has to do with the behaviors of Palestinians and Israelis on the ground. Now, you remember 4 years ago, the Obama administration tried to rebuild the confidence on the part of Israelis and Palestinians that had been shattered as a result of the 2008-2009 war in Gaza. And the feeling was that without some mechanisms to rebuild confidence in the two constituencies, it would be impossible to attract them to a peace process. The administration came up with an idea of using confidence-building measures. With respect to Israel, a complete settlements freeze was demanded. With respect to the Arabs, there were a number of issues put on the table that the administration asked the Arabs to fulfill. And as we know, the success of the confidence-building measure activity was, to put it mildly, relatively limited. The question then is, do you abandon the effort to change behaviors, or do you contextualize that effort once you have a strategy and a policy that is convincing to Israelis and Palestinians that it's not only focused on asking them to do the hard things that are hard for them to do. It is hard for Israelis, for an Israeli government, to unilaterally stop settlements. It's hard. It's hard legally and it's hard politically. It's the right thing to do, but we know how hard things are to do in our own democratic environment, and we therefore need to appreciate that it's going to be equally hard in the democratic environment of Israel. Would it be easier for an Israeli prime minister to take steps to slow down and ultimately stop settlements if the case could be made that the process of advancing peace is moving across a wide front? It's not just focused on one issue. Now, we know that since 2004, 2003, Israelis and Palestinians have agreed to change the behaviors that are most disruptive of this peace process. It's called the roadmap. The roadmap has been declared dead every year. Middle East, of course, you're not dead until you're dead and buried, and I'm not quite sure that the roadmap is yet buried. The fact is that both Israel and the Palestinians still have on record their agreement to carry out those obligations. I would suggest not asking them to do so out of context, but asking them to do so in the context of a broader, more determined American approach that, as I mentioned, advances these prospects of peace across a wider front. Sixth, in 2002 and subsequently, we saw the Arab states take decisions that were nothing short of cosmic, and they concretized into what has become known as the Arab Peace Initiative, changing the very definition of the conflict from the definition of 1948, in other words, should Israel exist, to the definition of what should Israel's boundaries be with respect to the occupation that started in 1967. This was and remains a fundamental shift in Arab politics and Arab policy. And nothing has happened to use this change in Arab policy to help advance the prospects of peace. Now, on the one hand, there's no need for either the United States or Israel to adopt an Arab peace initiative. That's Arab policy. But it is quite important to recognize what the Arabs have done and then to challenge the Arabs to actually do something about the policy that they've put forward. Now, Arab states have actually shown up in the peace process in the past. During the 1990s, as a result of the Madrid breakthrough, as I mentioned earlier, most Arab states participated in discussions and negotiations with Israel on these essentially behavioral questions in the region: economic issues, security issues, water, environment. So the taboo about talking to Israel was broken almost 20 years ago in the Arab world. We need to ask the Arabs to show up again, to take their initiative and to actualize it, to show the Israeli people that it's one thing to put on a piece of paper the ideas that are incorporated in the Arab initiative, and quite another to actually start advancing the elements of those initiatives through direct talks with Israel. Can this be done in the absence of a concerted peace strategy? Probably not. Can we expect it of Arabs in the context of a concerted peace strategy? We should. So it becomes the sixth element in this proposed American policy. And finally, I would add a seventh element, which is less a part of American thinking, but more something that we should be encouraging civil society, religious communities, track 2 think tanks to be doing. And that is to be looking at their own narratives, to be looking at their own definitions of this conflict, to be finding ways not just to talk between the two sides, but within each constituency. For Israelis to talk among themselves about settlements and democracy and what it means to be a Jewish state with not just a Palestinian state on its borders, but a large Palestinian population as part of its own citizenry. For Palestinians to talk about what they call the most critical issue in their national narrative, the refugee question. Can you be a refugee seeking a right of return to a state other than Palestine? If Palestine doesn't exist, then a refugee might want to return to a home that was left behind. If a state of Palestine does exist, then refugees cannot be expected, or the state of Israel cannot be expected, to open up its borders for the refugees to come to a state other than the state of Palestine. But this is a discussion for Palestinians to have among themselves. Because for them to accommodate to an outcome in negotiations in which the vast majority, if any, refugees actually return to the territory of the state of Israel, is going to be one of the most critical determinants of success of a peace process. Those, I would suggest then, those 7 elements might constitute an infrastructure, an architecture of an American policy. Let me add one additional element and then we'll have time for discussion, questions, and answers. And that's the politics. It's easy to come up with policy ideas. You write a position paper, you think about the ideas, you bounce them off your friends and colleagues, and they all look terrific once they're on paper. They look even better once they're in a bound book, I have to tell you. The question, though, is what happens when they hit the real world? When these ideas get tested in the environment of politics here in Washington, politics in Ramallah, politics in Jerusalem. And here, too, we need to do some very heavy thinking about how we relate as a government and as a people to the basic aspirations that motivate the Israeli and Palestinian people and that are used by the two governments to justify their current positions. We need to speak in a language of understanding and support to both Israelis and Palestinians, that we understand their narratives, and we're not trying to declare those narratives to be out of bounds or unacceptable. But we are trying to argue that we need to find a way to fit them together in a manner that allows these two peoples to live together, and over time, ultimately to develop a common narrative which can draw inspiration from their individual histories and their individual, the individual aspects of their shared or separate histories, but that don't represent an impediment to the political agreement that governments will need to reach. We need to speak differently to the peoples on both sides that have been nurtured on dreams that can't be fulfilled in this peace process. Settlers are not criminals. They are Israelis who have been asked over time, or who have volunteered over time, or who have demanded over time to move to an area that successive Israeli governments have said, go ahead and move to that area. They've been accommodated, they've been supported, they've been encouraged. We can't turn around and declare them all persona non grata. The refugee community has been nurtured over the past 60 plus years on the belief that Deus ex machina, they are all going to be airlifted back to homes they left behind in Palestine. And no one's been honest with them to understand that that's not going to happen. And so as we do our policy making in the inner councils in Washington, we need to be extraordinarily sensitive to the feelings, the gut-wrenching emotions of the actual people who are involved. And we can do that. It's a little mushy. Diplomats don't do a very good job in empathy, but we need to. And we need to find a way, even as we come up with smart policy ideas, to make those ideas palatable to constituencies in both Israel and Palestine that are ultimately going to have to make very challenging decisions on the pathway to peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to open the floor now to your questions. I'd like to ask you to identify yourself and wait for the mic. But I would like to ask you a question then, having gone through the book. Your last comment was that about the Palestinian and the right of return was a sign of dream. When I went through the book, I thought that some of the suggestions were also maybe a wish list, which are not possible to do. I mean, is your sense that the two sides, I mean, the Israelis and the Palestinians, are as willing to sit and negotiate for a solution as they were 10 years ago, or as they were when you started getting involved in this issue?
Well, clearly they're not. And we shouldn't fool ourselves into believing that even if we have smart policy on the part of the United States, that the Palestinians and Israelis will be, knocking down our door to come into the negotiating room. As I mentioned, it's a very different context from 20 years ago. And it's a context in which smart and reasonable people on both sides can make the argument that this is not the time to be testing the peace process. The argument I make, however, in response to that is I don't see things getting better without the effort to resolve this conflict. I see things getting worse from year to year. We all knew over the years that this was far more than just a political and geographic issue. This has always had a religious dimension to it. The religious dimension is now far more pronounced than it ever was. And the more pronounced it becomes over the coming years, even more difficult it will be to contemplate a resolution, number one. Number two, for our own national security interests, I don't think we can afford to allow the hesitancy of the Israelis and Palestinians to make peace to become our approach. We do want peace as much as the Palestinians and Israelis. And that argument you hear in Washington that we can't want peace more than they, I think is a false argument. We can certainly want peace as much, not just as a value, but as a hard-headed national security issue for us as we conduct our diplomacy in that region.
Thank you. Yes, please. Mike, please.
Thank you. I'm Dave Rabinowitz, and it seems to me the greatest existential threat to the state of Israel today does not come from the Palestinians, does not come from the Arab countries, it does not come from Iran. The greatest existential threat to Israel comes from Brooklyn in the form of fundamentalist ultra-Orthodox Jews who are trying to take over the state and basically are unwilling to give up even a square inch of territory to anybody. Now, every time there's been an appearance of a breakthrough in peace negotiations, a fundamentalist from one side or the other has basically destroyed it. And fundamentalism of any sort, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, or whatever, is inherently incompatible with democracy because if you know the will of God, why would you allow any other opinion to even be expressed, much less considered and adopted? The question is it meaningful to even talk about negotiations before addressing the issue of religious fundamentalism on all sides? And how do you address that?
Well, first of all, my wife is from Brooklyn, so I don't take this personally.
Yeah.
The reality is that peace in the Middle East is not going to be made in Brooklyn. It's going to be made by Israelis and by Palestinians. And frankly, having lived in Israel for 8 years, I had a tour of duty from 1982 to 86 in the American Embassy, and then back in the last decade as ambassador for 4 years. The plurality of views within Israeli society and the level of discussion about these issues is far more sophisticated than you're going to hear on Flatbush Avenue in Brooklyn. The people in Brooklyn, and I'm using it because you asked, you referred to it. People outside of the Middle East don't have to make hard choices because they're living in sheltered environments. People in the region are ready to make hard choices. Why do you see, for example, and I ask this question rhetorically, why do you see the consistency of polls that even if the two sides, as I just mentioned, are so hesitant to talk to each other, the people still actually support a two-state solution? And there's a consistency to this. I remarked the last time I came to the Woodrow Wilson Center about a phenomenon that we observed during the Intifada. I was ambassador during that period. And polling during the Intifada showed two very interesting trends in both communities. Both Israelis and Palestinians wanted to hurt each other. Palestinians thought that this was a way of venting their anger and their frustration and all of the trials and tribulations of occupation. Israelis wanted to hurt Palestinians because they were being hurt, and they felt that it was a way to quell the disturbances. And the same polls showed when they were asked, when Palestinian Israelis were asked, are you ready to do a two-state solution if it involved hard choices and compromises, a majority support in both communities. Counterintuitive, but it was a reality. So yes, you have to take into consideration the views of extremists. You have to think about ways to broaden the moderate base. You have, for example, now being done quite quietly, and therefore I'm not going to go into details. You have religious dialogue taking place between so-called fundamentalists on one side and so-called fundamentalists on the other. It's happening today in Israel and Palestine. It's happening through think tank support, through Track 2, not normally through government auspices. And it's very helpful, but the absence of that can't in itself become a roadblock to trying to resolve the political differences.
Thank you. Yes, please. I moved left, right, center. Yes, I'd say.
Dan Pollock from the Zionist Organization of America. You said in your remarks that the Palestinian community, for example, will have to have a discussion within its own groups about what it means for the right of return, and ultimately, you implied, give up their dream of mass population movement back to Israel. But it seems like there's an element of only one answer is acceptable and possible at the end of that discussion. What if, for example, in that discussion, and of course you mentioned the Saudi peace plan, which is not often remarked, but it actually contains within it the right of Palestinians to move back to pre-67 Israel. So you talked about the Arab peace plan being a positive development, but what if in the Palestinian discussions they end up really deciding that that is not the consensus within the community? How do we still have optimism in that case?
Well, let me first correct an error in the question. If you read the Arab Peace Initiative language, it talks about Palestinians exercising the right of return in relationship to international resolutions as agreed by the parties. In other words, the Arab states have recognized that there's not going to be a unilaterally determined solution to the refugee issue. It has to be as agreed. And that language was put into the Arab Peace Initiative very thoughtfully, because the Arab states understood that without that language, it would be unacceptable to the entirety of the State of Israel and also to most of the international community. So there's a recognition even in the Arab Peace Initiative language itself that something other than an circumscribed right of return will have to emerge. Hypothetically, which your question is a hypothetical question, both sides are going to have the right, once their leaders negotiate an agreement, to decide whether or not the agreement meets their needs. Israel is likely to do it through Knesset action, maybe through a national election. Palestinians have talked about a national referendum, and that's going to be where the rubber hits the road, where they have to make a decision whether or not they can accept an entirety of an agreement, even if they don't like parts of the agreement. The consistency, and I return to the polls in this case because they actually tell us something. The consistency in polls over the past 2 decades tell us that when you disaggregate the issues, if you only ask Palestinians, will you demand the right of return in the context of a peace settlement, the answer is overwhelmingly yes. When you aggregate the issues and say, will you support a peace settlement in which these 7 or 8 principles are established, the answer is also yes. And one of those principles in all of these aggregated polls is that there isn't a right of return that's not circumscribed. So yes, Palestinians may decide when they see an agreement that they don't like it, in which case you don't have a conflict-ending agreement. But I think until we test this proposition in the negotiating halls and through the public diplomacy that accompanies peace process, this is just going to be an interesting debate. We have to find out whether it's real or not.
Okay, David in the back, David Ottaway.
Dave Ottaway, a senior scholar here. I'm curious how you see what's happening in Syria affecting the willingness of Israel or the Palestinians to undertake the kind of process you're suggesting.
Look, I think it's certainly used by many, and not without reason, as a reason not to take risks in a peace process with Palestinians. There's concern about the future direction of Egypt, of Libya. There's concern about the stability of some other surrounding states. And there's certainly concern about what kind of an outcome will emerge in Syria and whether or not it's going to exacerbate what until now had been a relatively quiet frontier on Israel's part. And it leads to a binary choice as far as I'm concerned. The one choice is the hunker down option, which is let's wait and see how things emerge in these neighboring countries. If they emerge in a manner that is conducive to Israel's enhancing its own security, then be ready to move forward. And if not, don't move forward. And the other side of the binary choice is, why not use this moment to try to set, in a sense, our own house in order so that when there is an outcome in Syria, whether it is more beneficial for Israel's security or less, there won't also be this ongoing problem at home. I vote for the second of the binary options. It doesn't mean that you give away the shop. It doesn't mean that you set up an agreement or negotiate an agreement which weakens your basic security elements. But it translates or interprets security in a much wider frame than simply the number of guns you have relative to the number of guns your neighbors have. Can you develop a relationship with Palestinians that's different from the relationship that Israel has had since 1967, since 1948, in fact? And can that be a security enhancer together with all of the other things that go with security? You know, limited forces and disarmament and who knows what. And in that respect, I think it's far wiser for a country not to act like an ostrich, and you know which part of the ostrich's anatomy is exposed when it puts its head in the ground.
Ambassador.
First of all, Dan, thank you for being here. We welcome you, and it's terrific having you. My question involves the Gaza and rule by Hamas. How does that fit into the equation? And also, do you think that Israel will ever be accepted by the Palestinians as a Jewish state, which seems to be a critical part of it?
Yeah. Look, the issue in Gaza is complicated for lots of reasons, not just because of the bifurcation of the Palestinian geography and polity, but also because of the growing significance of Hamas within Palestinian politics. In a sense, Hamas is now determines when there's war and when there's hudna. And we've seen this over the past 7 years 3 times. With the kidnapping of Gilad Shalit, the 2008 uptick in the rockets, which led to that war, and then this past year. And the question is whether or not all of us, and I tend only to focus on American policy because the Israelis have to focus on theirs and the Palestinians have to focus on theirs, whether all of us are being smart with respect to what's happening on the ground. And what I mean by this is, have the policies that we've adopted vis-a-vis Hamas led to its weakening or unintentionally contributed to its strengthening. For example, the blockade and siege, which the United States has largely supported, in which Israel has had, up until very recently, for a number of years since 2007, restricted almost entirely the importation of a large number of materials and goods. Talk to the governor of the Central Bank of Palestine, the head of the Palestine Monetary Authority, and he'll tell you that the only party hurt by that blockade has been the Palestinian Authority. Because the income that they used to derive from the importation of goods through Ashdod and then transshipped into Gaza, where Israel collected the taxes and the customs and the duties and then transferred that money to the Palestinian Authority, that has gone down to zero. Hamas has regulated the tunnel traffic. It's become like the Holland Tunnel. They collect the tolls. They license the businesses that do the smuggling, and they decide what gets smuggled. So the siege, the blockade, designed to weaken Hamas, has strengthened Hamas financially, and it's weakened the Palestinian Authority. Now, that doesn't mean that you open up trade and commerce overnight. It's a challenging security issue. It does mean, however, that you sit down with your security people and your finance people and your planners, and you try to figure out what it is that we're all doing wrong that's helping the party that we have not wanted to help and hurting the party that we have not wanted to hurt. So I think there are ways to start dealing with Gaza, but it doesn't really answer your question. I think over time we have to rely upon the PLO as the negotiating partner. Palestinian politics are going to be quite disruptive for a period of time. My graduate students at Princeton developed an idea of a 2.5-state solution. For the time being, their argument is we may have to live with Gaza not being part of the state of Palestine, but the issues involving Gaza being part of the agreement. So that when Gaza and the West Bank do merge again or unify again, they're merging into an agreed framework and an agreed structure. On the second question, Joe, it's a question that's very hotly debated in Israel. You listen to some very smart people in Israel who ask, why are we asking the Palestinians to recognize the character of our state when we haven't yet defined the character of our state? Israel still has no constitution. And it has no constitution because they have some very challenging social, philosophical, religious issues that either have not yet been mediated into words that would form a constitution, or that people don't want to try to do that because it would be too disruptive. And there's therefore a question of, is this a formal demand of Palestinians, or is it a demand that when Ariel Sharon articulated it during the time that I was ambassador, it was less of an issue for the negotiations than it was as a long-term idea of acceptance. The idea that, as he articulated it at the time, real peace, even if there's a peace treaty, real peace would only exist when the Arab neighbors have accepted the right of Jews to establish a state in the historical homeland of the Jews. But for Sharon, that was not a requirement in the peace process. I don't think he expected a Palestinian to stand up and take that oath. And that's going to be one of the questions. How is this being articulated as a long-term vision of acceptance, or does it become an issue that Israeli negotiators raise for Palestinians to have to say yes or no? And I think if it's raised in that second context, then it could become a challenging obstacle.
We are taking one last question, the lady in white, but just the question, no comments, just your question, please, because we are running out of time. Thank you. Yes, just the question.
Okay, I'm Allison Good. I'm currently a master's candidate at the Elliott School of Middle East Studies, focusing on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And my question is, on your long wish list, you talked a lot about Track 2 negotiations and public diplomacy. And I'm wondering, with the Israeli government set to undergo a major transition with elections on the 22nd and the Palestinian Authority deeply in debt, both politically and economically, how do you see Track 2 diplomacy overcoming the very depressing public faces of these two entities?
Well, first, it wasn't a wish list. It was a policy prescription. And I guess you've now revealed your view of that policy prescription. I guess we have to prolong this session a little bit longer. Look, Track 2 is never going to be a substitute for what governments have to do on behalf of their constituencies and what people have to ultimately do in terms of supporting or not supporting those decisions. But an effective Track 2 can help condition attitudes and ultimately change attitudes. At a minimum, it gets people to know other people in a way that they didn't know them before. There is still a community of Israelis and Arabs who participated in the 1990s in the multilateral negotiations. There were 5 tracks of negotiations. There's a community of Israelis and Arabs that know each other, and many of them have kept in touch, email and faxes, and when they're traveling and showing up at these Track 2 meetings. And that's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean they're the best of friends, and it doesn't mean that that's the dawning of the age of Aquarius, and now, you know, everybody is the kumbaya around the campfire. But the more you break down stereotypes, the more you humanize this conflict, the more you introduce the two publics into the discussion, over time, the easier it will be for governments to make decisions. So particularly now, when governments are not ready in that region to take the initiative to come into a peace process, particularly now, it's a moment when Track 2 ought to be expanded to try to bring about more contact between Israelis and Palestinians and Israelis and other Arabs. Not that they're necessarily going to come out with a peace treaty at the end of a Track 2 meeting, but people move in and out of government. People move in and out of different phases of life, and they help create the public opinion on which basis governments will ultimately make these policy decisions. So that's the context in which what you call a wish list and I call a policy can contribute to a successful peace process.
I know there are many more hands up, but we have run out of time. But Ambassador Kurtzer is going to sign books, and we are serving lunch. So please join us in thanking them. Thank you very much. We could have sat for another 30 minutes.